My name is George Despotas, and I'm interviewing Mr. George Green today as part of the Victory Through Valor project. It's December the 8th, 2013. Good morning, Mr. Green.
Good morning.
How are you doing today?
Not too bad.
Well, good.
Not too bad. No, I shouldn't say too bad. I'm doing better than I did yesterday.
Well, that's good, because we have a long interview today. Well, what we're going to do with this interview is kind of recap your experiences during World War II, a little bit before World War II, but also after. During is the majority, and then after. So I think the way to start this off is perhaps for us to get a description from you regarding before you entered military service. What were your interests? What did you have plans in terms of future employment?
No, I really didn't, and I still think at 18 years or 17 years old, most kids don't have any real ambitions. About the only thing that interests me at that time is aviation, and I used to build model airplanes out of balsa wood and read stories about fighter races in World War I. And that was about it. There wasn't anything no deep thoughts on being the president or anything like that.
So perhaps, if anything, you might have been a pilot had it not been for the war.
It might have been.
But you did, in fact, get a pilot's license, didn't you, after the war?
After the war, I did, but I was always interested in aviation.
Now, what about your childhood? You obviously experienced the Depression, and how did that affect your family and your childhood?
Well, my father was a World War I veteran with a slight disability, and as a result, he would pass out occasionally and couldn't hold a job, so he ended up being selling popcorn at carnivals. And we were born in Chicago, and at that time we had 6 children, and the 3 oldest ones were sent to an orphanage. And then from the orphanage, the 3 of us were distributed to a foster home. My brother and I went to one, and my sister went to the other. And come the early part of the summer, the dad came around in a pickup truck with a mattress in the back and picked us all up, and we headed towards Philadelphia because that's where he was originally born. So we went and left, and he would stop at gas stations and fill up with gas, and then stop at the priest house, the First Catholic place, and then bum money for food, and then we eventually ended up with the truck falling apart at Harrisburg, and we camped in a farmer's yard, and he went in town and he traded the truck in for bus tickets for Greyhound buses to the rest of Chicago, or the rest of the way to Philadelphia. So then we lived in Philadelphia for 7 years. We lived in 5 different houses, and we even had what would today be called a mobile home. He found a circus wagon, and he put it on a lot in Philadelphia that he rented for $1 a year, paid $9 for the circus wagon, and converted it into what today would be a mobile home with bunk beds and a potbelly stove and an ice box on the porch. So we lived in there until the city of Philadelphia decided that we would have to move because they outlawed outhouses, and we had an outhouse. And so the Red Cross found us another place to live. So then the rest of the time was going from house to house. The old man would pay the bill, and first bill, and then take about 6 months we'd get kicked out, and we'd end up at another place to live. So, but we didn't realize how bad it was. But we had enough food to eat. We got relief food. We got relief shirts. Everybody took care of each other, and it was a different type of depression, and the community was a lot different than it is today. So then we ended up back in Chicago.
Okay. Do you think those struggles you had in childhood kind of prepared you for the rest of your life, and how you had to struggle during the war and otherwise?
Not particularly, because we didn't realize at that age, kids, all we wanted to do was have our fun and do whatever we could. But I don't think it had any effect on my future at all.
Okay. Well, do you remember the date that you enlisted into the service?
Yes, that was November the 27th in 1939.
And where did you complete your basic training at?
I was in ROTC high school, and we had probably the best sergeant in the Army, Sergeant George Bassnagel. And he introduced us to the possibility of Citizens Military Training Camp, and we signed up for that. And the second year of high school, we spent a month at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, learning infantry training by the Army with 3 meals a day. And then then, of course, with ROTC, we had rifle firing, and we had training of all sorts of military. And then I enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve, and went to Camp Perry, Ohio for 2 weeks of rifle firing. The Marines were always big on firing your weapon. And then I was fairly well trained by the time we were called active duty.
Okay. Do you remember what division you were first assigned to in the Marines?
We were first assigned to the 2nd Defense Battalion in San Diego.
Okay.
And we were studying 50 caliber anti-aircraft machine guns. And we did that for maybe 3 months or so, and got to be well acquainted with, and actually did live firing off of Point Loma in San Diego, shooting at the sleeves towed by airplanes. But then the Germans were attacking in Europe, and they were using Stuka bombers to attack the artillery. So the Marine Corps decided that the artillery should have our anti-aircraft protection. So I was transferred to the 10th Marines, which was the 2nd Marine Division.
Okay. Would you say, or how would you assess the drill work, the techniques taught, the discipline that was instilled in the Marine Corps or by specific commissioned officers or non-coms who trained you? Do you think that played an important role in your success on the battlefield?
Most of the military personnel that I was exposed, higher ranked personnel, at that time in the reserves, were usually Marines that had been in the regular service and stayed in the reserve when they got out. And the officers were well trained, and I must say that generally speaking, uh, most Marines I associated with the higher rank were normally fairly well qualified and did a very good job in assisting us uh, younger people.
Would you say that the training you obtained in the military with the Marine Corps prior to battle really prepared you well for battle, or was there no way to really prepare one for battle?
There really was no way to prepare for battle. It was just a repeat. You would be training and training and training, and as you trained, you accepted certain things, and when you were ready to go, you were ready.
Now, how about the officers or the non-coms that trained you? Do you think that perhaps the ones that had a more regimented or more stern approach to teaching the skills had a bigger impact on you, or did?
I didn't. I wasn't exposed to very strong officers or non-coms. They were all pretty sensible people, in my opinion.
Okay. What was your first actual deployment? I believe through into the ETO.
Well, what happened is Roosevelt met with Churchill in Argentia Bay, Newfoundland, and Churchill wanted Roosevelt to replace the British troops in Iceland with American troops, which Roosevelt agreed to. And the Army at that time was full of draftees and could not put together a combat unit. So, because the draft said that no draftees can be sent overseas unless they volunteer. Well, the Marine Corps was all volunteer. So that's how we ended up being transferred from San Diego through the Panama Canal, Charleston, Argentia Bay, and then Reykjavik, Iceland.
Okay.
So we relieved the British troops up there in Iceland.
Do you recall how you heard about Pearl Harbor?
I was in Iceland. We spent most of our time unloading ships, and I don't think we ever once deployed any of our weapons. We were unloading ships. We were building Quonset huts for the Army that was coming up to replace us. And as a result, we would have maybe once every 3 weeks a free time to go to Reykjavik, the city of Reykjavik, and have some fun, which would mostly consist of finding a restaurant to have a nice meal, and then not much alcohol was available to us up there. So we were in the 3/4 ton open truck in a snowstorm, going into Reykjavik on our rest spot, and as we passed the British soldiers, they would give us the V sign, which is what Churchill always did. And he'd make statements like, we're glad you're with us, we're glad you're with us. What the heck are they talking about? Well, by the time we got into Reykjavik, into the restaurant, we found out that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor.
Can you recall what thoughts raced through your head when you heard that? And
The only thing we thought of, the Army's got to get up here in a hurry and get us back to the States because we were going to end up in the Pacific.
So you knew it was your destiny to fight in the Pacific then?
Right.
And did you have any trepidation about that, or?
No, we actually looked forward to it because didn't want to be in Iceland all the time.
I see. Okay. So can we then move on to what was your first deployment to the Pacific Theater of Operations?
In February, in February 43, we left San Diego and headed to New Zealand on the SS Lurline without escorts. And we finally landed after about 3 weeks or 2 weeks in Auckland, New Zealand.
And then subsequent to that, I think you went to Guadalcanal, is that right?
Well, from New Zealand, we did nothing but training in New Zealand, including 50-mile hikes and things of that nature. So then in July of 43, we boarded the Crescent City and was delivered to Guadalcanal. At that time, Guadalcanal there was no fighting going on there. The only thing is we had a lot of air raids, and we had to dig slit trenches and things of that nature. And we just continued the jungle training down there on Guadalcanal.
Were there any thoughts that you can recall that were going through your mind when you were doing that training in either New Zealand or Guadalcanal, or you were just focused on the training?
Just focused on training.
Okay.
A lot of firing exercise, regardless of what the weather was.
So that moves us, I think, into the period between November of 43 to January 44, and your first engagements, formal engagements, were with Bougainville and the Northern Solomon Islands, as I recall. When you were deployed to Bougainville, what outfit were you with then?
I was with the F Battery, 2nd Battalion, 12th Marines. I was the gunnery sergeant of the battery, as my rank was sergeant.
Okay, and in terms of the invasion of Bougainville, at what point at D-Day beyond did you enter?
It was after D-Day, probably somewhere around the 7th of the month. We boarded LSTs in Guadalcanal and landed at Bougainville.
Was there anything racing through your mind, or did you have some apprehension before entering your first battlefield condition?
Not particularly, because I thought we were well trained, and the most important thing was, after all of the training we did, we're finally going to get to use our expertise, and we were looking forward to our first battle.
So I guess, can you then describe your first engagement on Bougainville, or describe how you entered the beachhead and what you experienced at that point?
At the first part, the entrance into Bougainville, the ships were all lined up going in towards the beach. And we had, on the LSTs, we had vehicles on the top deck with machine guns for anti-aircraft protection. And I decided that even though they said everybody stay below decks, since I was the battery gunnery sergeant, I could do what I wanted. And I decided to go to topside and see what was going on. And as I entered the first blackout curtain, they had two blackout curtains. Uh, I just started the second blackout curtain when all of a sudden everybody on the LST and the whole crew of other ships started firing anti-aircraft. So it scared me and I went back. But then I thought better of myself and I finally got on the top deck. And it was as dawn was breaking. And and everybody was firing. You never saw such fireworks in all your life, being the first time that we were exposed to anything like that. And then all of a sudden, this Jap torpedo plane came right across our bow, and I would guess he might be 500 feet, as low as 500 feet. And every gun was shooting at him, tracers all over the place. You could see the pilot, you could see the gunner. And he went from our right to right across our bow to the left. On our left was a APD, an APD transport. And that was used, it was a World War I destroyer used as transport for raiders and Marines like that. And we had a survey crew aboard that ship, and it about 10 men. And it also had the infantry, 3rd Battalion, 21st Marines. And so that torpedo plane just passed us by with nobody hitting them, and then dropped the torpedo, and all of a sudden the McKean, you saw a big ball of fire on the USS McKean, and it finally sank. But being close to shore, there were a lot of landing craft that went out to pick up the survivors. And we only lost one man on that ship. And he was, where anybody saw him at last, he was topside, where all the others were below. So he was the only one lost. And the landing craft and everything picked up most of the other people.
Now, do you remember, did you land on the beachhead on a Higgins boat, or?
No, we landed, the LSTs would go in and they would have bow doors that would open up and a ramp that would drop down. And we loaded everything, unloaded everything off of that ramp onto the water and the beach. And we spent the day, it also had a large amount of 55-gallon gasoline drums. So we rolled those into the surf and rolled them up on the beach, and we spent the first night there on the beach because it took us all day to get that one LST unloaded.
So there wasn't much active fire on the beachhead when you actually landed on Bougainville?
No,
Okay.
because they were actually started work, the Seabees, because they landed with the first waves, and they were building an airfield along the beach for fighters.
So then you slept in the foxhole that first night, right?
Yeah, I slept in the foxhole right off of the beach there the first night.
Anything happened the next morning when you woke up?
No, not particularly. Except that we were able to get our guns and our weapons and everything in a position to start supporting the infantry.
Were there any Japanese planes strafing you at any point?
There was one went through the area very fast, but that was just the one.
I see.
So we got our guns in position, having to cut down a lot of trees, and and to our right was the remnants of the McKean infantry bivouacked.
So the second day, did you stay on the beach or did you move inland?
We moved inland on the second day and got our guns in position.
So my understanding that second night was quite exciting, right?
Yes.
Can you describe what happened that night?
Uh, we all dug in and got our weapons protected by sandbags and everything else. And we had to cut down a lot of trees, which we tossed over to the right side. And it was very swampy. The water table was very low. You could only dig maybe a foot down. And as a result, we dug the foxholes and we hung most of our weapons and things up on the trees. And we had a mess tent and got that up and so that night we had an air raid, and the spotlights or the air lights for the aircraft picked up 3 bombers, and they came right over our position and dropped their bombs. And you would swear that that bomb was coming right at you. And so the sergeant next to me said to me, "Are you scared?" And I said, "Well, my knees are shaking." So the first bomb landed between two of our guns. Second bomb landed within 15 feet of all of us being dug in. And not one of us was hit. But the third bomb landed in with the 21st Marines that were bivouacked to our right. And they had taken our logs and built up in foxholes. But there were 25 of them that were killed or wounded from that one bomb. But below, as long as you were below the surface, and you did not get a direct hit, you were pretty safe from any bombing. So that night and the next night, we had the same thing happen, that the 3 bombers came over with the lights on them and dropped the bomb. This time one bomb hit in our powder bag area and caused quite an explosion. But again, everybody was underground and we had no direct hits, so two burial bombings. And each of the anti-aircraft guns firing at those airplanes were always behind it. I never saw a Japanese plane shot down by anti-aircraft fire.
You mentioned earlier the first bomb on the second night went between your artillery pieces. At the time, those were 75 millimeter pack howitzers. Was that right?
Yes, 75 millimeter pack howitzers.
Okay. After that third night, did you stay in that location or did you move inland further?
There was plans for us to move forward, and we went up and reconnoitered. But we found out that there really wasn't any sense of moving because the purpose of the landing at Bougainville was to take enough land to build a fighter strip and a bomber strip. And we could fire our pack howitzers to support the infantry from where our position was. So we stayed there all the way through the whole battle.
So my understanding was you were a sergeant in charge of the gun battery, which involved 4 75 millimeter pack howitzers. Can you describe what your role was in that position?
Well, I was what was called the battery gunnery sergeant, and I was responsible for all four of those guns and other activities of the battery that the first sergeant was not responsible for. And I went there as a sergeant, but got battlefield promotion to platoon sergeant.
Excuse me. Um, do you recall approximately how many times you had to initiate artillery fire during your time on Bougainville? Was it several times every day? Was it, every hour? Or was it episodic and that one day you would have to fire several rounds and then other days you'd have to be firing continuously?
No, it was in the jungle, the fighting in the jungle, we did not fire as often as just the future, through the simple reason that it was difficult to determine where the infantry was and things of that nature. But generally speaking, most of our firing was done in preparation of the attack of the infantry. And on, I think I want to say the 27th or so of November, we made a very big artillery barrage so the infantry could attack. And we must have fired each battery, the regiment, probably fired at one time into this one area where the attack was, called the Coconut Grove, and it was very effective. And the infantry said that when they walked through there, they could find the Japanese that would be incoherent and everything if they weren't dead or wounded.
So is that typically the case that you've learned from the guys in the field that your artillery was quite effective, quite much on target, and
generally speaking, but you always had the possibility of somebody making a mistake, and it happened on Bougainville, it happened on Guam, and I'm sure I know it happened on Iwo Jima.
And you're referring to friendly fire?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's unfortunately one of the horrible things of war. Did you have any close calls on Bougainville?
Just the bombing of the 2 days of 2 nights of bombing. That was about the closest one that we ever had.
Did you lose any good friends on that island, or did you know any of those guys that were hit on that third bomb?
No, we just lost PFC Rogers on the McKean, and we didn't know anybody from the 3rd Battalion, 21st Marines to our right that were killed or wounded.
Do you know approximately when you left Bougainville?
We left Bougainville, I believe it was on about the 29th of January, and returned on a transport to Guadalcanal.
And what was your rank at that point, and what were you assigned to?
When I got back to Guadalcanal, they promoted me again to gunnery sergeant.
And then what was your assigned task at that point?
Well, I was still the battery gunnery sergeant.
I see. Was there any other specific function where you assigned to the airfields in Guadalcanal, or?
No, it was back to the old training.
I see.
And recreation-wise, they had some movies, but you had, by that time, you could do away with mosquito nets, except for sleeping. You had to sleep under a mosquito net. And they had built some movies. You sit on coconut logs and watch a movie. And about the only thing with Guadalcanal and Bougainville, it must have rained every afternoon.
So other than movies and the periods between your training on Guadalcanal, what did you or other men do to pass the time? Did you play cards? Did you?
Yeah, well, most of the guys, played cards or shoot craps or a lot of letter writing and stuff of that nature. We did have one USO show, and it was the Army USO show, and the headliner from the USO was some guy by the name of Jack Parr, which we never heard of until quite some time ago. But that's the only recreation that we would have.
Now, before we move into Guam and the Mariana Islands, I believe in April '43, you were on a task force that was originally assigned to invade the island of Caving. Is that right?
Cavite, yes.
Cavite.
We were actually on the beach boarding transports for the Battle of Cavite. We were to land on a separate little island to support the infantry, and it was pretty well organized what we were going to do. And we were actually right there on the dock to get aboard the landing craft when we got word that they canceled the Battle of Cavite because they captured another small island, Green Island, that was further to the west of Rabaul, and so that ended pretty much the Northern Solomons campaign.
Let's move on then to Guam and the Marianas, and that was, I believe, between July '44 to August '44. Do you remember when you arrived at Guam initially? Or was there initial invasion plans that were deterred or deferred?
I keep saying we trained, and we really did train. Now, on Guadalcanal, we trained by getting off of a transport down the cargo net with our 75-pack howitzers, which, by the way, came in sections. You could disassemble it, and then you would have to assemble it up once you got ashore. And so that was, they had a certain number of amphibian tractors that would go right on up the shore. So the thought was that get the artillery right to their positions. But in order to do that, the infantry had to be delivered first. So what we practiced was to go into an LCVP landing craft, which carries about 36 men, and then we would rendezvous with a amphibian tractor and transfer our weapons to the LVT, and then the LVT would take us ashore. So we've done that several times. But when we got ready to land on Guam, there were no LVTs available because they were either destroyed or were used for some other purpose. And we were in the fifth wave with in the landing boats. And so we had to land right up to the beach, to the shore, which was a coral reef, about 200 yards or more before you hit any sand or beach. So we had to go right up to the coral and unload all of our weapons and ammunition and put them in the coral reef. And we were under mortar fire but fortunately none of us hit because the mortars, when they hit the water, would go deeper before they would explode, rather than on land where it hit the land and explode right away. So the blast would go more vertical than it would be horizontal. So we were able to carry all of our equipment from the end of the reef up until the beach where we set up our howitzers. And by the end of the first day, we were in position ready to fire.
So you said the pack howitzers were disassembled and reassembled. They probably varied in terms of the weight and the size of each component of the pack howitzer, but could they be, big pieces of metal that would weigh 100 pounds or 150 pounds? Or?
Oh, yeah, it would be more. For instance, the barrel component, which was the main part, was carried by 4 men. You had steel poles in the front and the back, so that was probably 300 pounds. So you had to really carry that stuff. And then you had the trails, and you had the wheels, the tires. So they were all fairly heavy components.
So that coral reef was out a couple hundred yards. How deep was that? Was that 1 or 2 feet below the surface, or?
I would say probably it averaged about 2 feet deep. But maybe once in a while it would, it would be very lumpy, like a bunch of coral, a bunch of stuff that would be various. It would be no smooth going. You had to be careful where you stepped.
Yeah, it could be slimy. You could slip, and when you have a heavy load on your back. Mm-hmm. So probably people struggled quite a bit to get those.
Oh yeah, it was a struggle to get across that reef compared to a beach.
Did you have machine gun fire on you as well, or?
No, we did not have. The only thing that we had was some mortar fire.
I see. No large artillery came in?
No artillery came in.
Okay. So that was a fairly exciting, so that was probably your most, one of your most exciting moments and most threatening moments when you're under fire trying to offload those howitzers, right? I mean, that probably, you still have a vivid image of that.
Yeah, right. The only other thing there on Guam is that the second day we had a banzai attack, and the Japs was always destroy the troops on the beach. And on the second day of the banzai attack, I had been up all night the first night because we were firing and everything. And finally the lieutenant said, Green, crawl in my foxhole and go to sleep. So I crawled in the foxhole to go to sleep, and I woke up, and when I woke up I heard all this noise going on. We were firing like mad, and I finally got up and said, what's going on? And he said, well, the Japs had a banzai attack. So the lieutenant said, gather up, just leave 3 men on the mission, on each gun. We got to have the men go up and support the infantry with the banzai attack, because some of the Japs were wanting to get down to the artillery. So I went and we had one corporal, and I put him in charge, and he didn't want to go. And I said, well, you just got to go because you're the only corporal we got, and these other guys are PFCs. So finally he went, but he got wounded, so he might have had a promotion, and I never saw him again.
Well, I guess being wounded At least he survived.
Absolutely, yeah, I'm sure he survived.
Good. But probably several other fellow Marines were killed in action with that Banzai attack then.
Oh, there was a lot of guys attacked, but there was it wiped out the Japs. After the Banzai attack, we moved pretty fast.
So you personally, formally weren't involved in the battle with that Banzai attack?
Yes.
Okay. Did you move inland from that point? Where were you stationed for the majority of your time on Guam? Did you go inland?
Well, they were moving so fast, we moved about 3 times. And 2 of the times we didn't even fire. So finally we got up to near the end of the island and stayed there for the rest of the battle, supporting the infantry.
So that was on the other end of the island, you said, or
Yeah,
north end?
yeah,
And so you spent most of your time in that location.
right. That was the last time. Although we did, we did on several occasions have some local skirmishes, you know.
Right. How were the conditions on Guam relative to Bougainville? Were they similar type islands? Were the fighting as fierce, or how would you describe that?
Well, Guam was more mountainous where we were fighting, and a lot of jungle. It had both. You could see in a lot of places great distance, but in other places they're just like jungle. So it was a combination of Guadalcanal and later on what we had. The Bougainville had mountains too, but we never went that far because we only, but you could see the mountains, but on Guam we had to fight the mountains.
So from either your experiences or talking with other Marines, do you think the fighting was more fierce on one of those 2 islands?
I would say Guam was more
Fierce?
but on Bougainville it was much more difficult because of the jungle.
I see. So in Guam, how often would you say they called in artillery fire? Was it more frequently than Bougainville? Was it once a day or several times in a day? Or
Guam was quite often. Quite often. We did a lot of firing on Guam.
So it's not just for in advance of an attack, but also they found fixed fortifications. They wanted you to knock those out or whatever.
I would say most of it was supporting the infantry. If there could be a pillbox or something, you know, or whatever it had.
So you mentioned in Bougainville that your feedback was that your artillery was very effective. Did you get the same perspective or impression for Guam?
Yes, we got when I say we, our battalion got a Navy unit citation for Bougainville. So we were probably more efficient in Bougainville than we were on Guam.
And again, you were in Guam, you were in charge of a battery?
Yeah, I was the gunnery sergeant again.
But in that role, you were not actually directing the fire in terms of location and
No.
coordinates and all that?
No.
Was that was that an officer that was directing that?
Yeah, then, and we ended up with a very nice base camp on Guam. But we would be sending patrols out all the time because you were finding stragglers all over the island. In fact, we had to go probably next person to person, line up and go through the whole northern part of Guam, because the Army engineers were building the airfields. And the Japs would be, the stragglers would be coming down to their mess and trying to get food and things, so that they were quite concerned about their security. So we swept, actually what we did was swept the whole northern island, and we found one Japanese prisoner. Or we found one Japanese, and he was starving to death. So we just put him on the back of a truck, and he had no will to resist or anything, because he was in pretty bad physical shape. And that's the only prisoner I saw taken on Guam.
Now, were you involved, or did you lead these patrols?
No, I didn't have to do any of that. Most of the patrols were led by second lieutenants, the lower rank officers.
I see. Did you have any close calls on Guam?
Not particularly. About the closest was we had put our position in, and we would camouflage our guns in our position, and we would then throw the old camouflage away and stuff of that nature. And so one night we posted. You always had sentries out for posting, and a couple of hand grenades kept going off, and you didn't know whether somebody was there or not. But the next day, when we changed our camouflage, one of the Marines recognized that there was a Jap in the ditch, and so we got a crew went over there, and they killed him. And the funny thing about it, he had this kid picked up a beautiful gold watch from this Jap. It was an officer, and some warrant officer from the battalion said, "Well, give me that," you know. So he gave it to him, and I went to the battery commander, and I told him, I said, that wasn't right for him to do that. So he raised hell with the commander, and the commander said, take that watch and give it back to that PFC. So that guy carried that carried that watch for as long as I could. You know, he lived. What happened to him, I don't know.
So you obviously weren't in the field nearly as much in these two islands, but did those type of activities happen frequently, where they would take whatever possessions the Japanese had? And
you always had some guy that would be hard-nosed about it, you know, pull his rank, so to speak. But most of us, you know, took up for the enlisted men. And whenever somebody goofed up, we got it straightened out.
a lot of people have documented in the Pacific Theater, especially with the savagery of the fighting and everything, you know, both sides did things that would be outrageous. You know, I remember hearing stories that, you know, they would cut off prisoners, or not prisoners, but the dead soldiers' ears and that type of thing. Did you experience anything to that extreme?
No, and I'm not so sure how that. You always had, when you have a troop unit, you always have a couple of weird people in it. and I'm sure that it might have happened, but I never saw it, or I never knew of anybody that did it. So I would say it might have occurred, but if it did occur, it would be minor in my opinion.
And as you probably have seen, there have been a lot of movies made about World War II and Pacific Theater in particular, and some of them display the fairly diffuse profanity that's used. And what was your experience? Was that accurate, or was that not accurate at all?
No, that's not accurate at all, because most of the people that I've been exposed to in the Marine Corps were Christian type people, and you had always a minor percentage that used filthy languages. They were mostly uneducated, or lower education. They didn't know any better words, and so. But I don't think I ever heard an officer swear. I don't think I ever heard, I never heard a NCO swear at an enlisted man, at a lower rank guy. So you always got some guy that's got a filthy mouth. But generally speaking, I would say the majority of people that fought in World War II did not use filthy language.
I guess it maybe would be also predicated on the conditions in the heat of battle, and somebody's yelling. That's a different ball game than,
I can't imagine that even in the heat of battle you would be using
that type of language.
Language like that.
Did you lose any good friends or fellow Marines on the island in Guam?
We lost two Marines, one due to some alcohol drank, the other was several were wounded. Some of the FOs, forward observers, were wounded, evacuated. Our battalion surgeon was wounded and sewed himself up, sewed in his leg without anything. So Schoenberg.
Is there anybody that you would provide a commendation for, any of your fellow Marines, anybody that either on Bougainville or Guam really you saw performed exceptionally well, or you would provide them with some merit?
I really didn't see anybody do anything extraordinary other than what their job was. I didn't have, outside of that one corporal that didn't want to go, but did go, I never saw anything like that happening. I would say the people that I served with were good people.
Very good. Okay, Mr. Green, let's move on to Iwo Jima. And as you probably recall, D-Day was on February 19th of 1945 for that island. Can you tell me who you were with on D+1 and what your role was at that time, and what your rank was?
On D+1, I was promoted to warrant officer. They wanted to make me a second lieutenant, but that would have to go to Washington, D.C. But by sending a note to Pearl Harbor, they could appoint me a warrant officer right away. And they needed lower rank officers. for Iwo Jima, so that's how I ended up as being appointed a warrant officer. And as a warrant officer, naturally I was assigned as a artillery forward observer, so that on D+1, being right into the area where the battle occurred, I was warrant officer.
And which outfit was that with?
I was attached to the 3rd Battalion, 21st Marines.
3rd Marine Division?
3rd Marine Division.
Okay.
And
Anything else special about that day, the 20th of February?
Well, the 20th of February was my 23rd birthday.
It's quite a way to spend it, wasn't it?
Yeah. So
What did you actually do on D+1? Were you, I believe, circling in the ship? Is that right? What were you doing?
what we did is we got aboard. The day before, we kept records of what was happening, and we were told before noontime that the chances are we would be going ashore the next day. So the next day, that's what we did. We climbed down the cargo nets into the LCVPs. And each of the group of 4 LCPs, 2 would circle around the bow and 2 will circle around the stern. So that's where we spent the entire day, with people throwing up seasick and disposing of internal waste and everything. So it was, the other thing was that the LCVPs were diesel, and you had that odor all day from the one in front of you. So later on during the years, whenever I got behind a diesel bus, my mind would automatically go back to that day.
So it's not the type of birthday party you would have wanted for yourself, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay. Well, it was an extreme condition. So you were circling on D+1, and then I believe it's D+2 that you entered
Yeah,
Iwo Jima formally. Can you describe that beach landing and where you landed exactly?
We went aboard ship that night. We got to crawl back up the cargoes, and next morning we were again down in the cargo nets to the LCVPs, and we got to the control point, and they said you could go into shore. We'll go into Red Beach too, and so we landed there on Red Beach 2. And crawled up to a great big shell hole in which we dug additional holes for each individual person. I had a 6-man FO team. I had a radio man, I had a scout sergeant, and then the others were wiremen. They would take care of all of the wires for the telephone. And so we got there, and we were, the beach was still under sporadic mortar fire. There was one LST that was just below us and to the north. And there was one mortar that came, and you could see it coming, and it hit just beside the LST in the water. Did not cause any damage. But we could hear firing going on all day, the first day.
Now, this obviously substantially was different than your experience on Guam and Bougainville in terms of the landing. So you were under fire, and in addition, you were serving in a new role as a forward observer team leader. And did you have any trepidation about that role? Did you? I know that that's not the function you performed on the other islands. So did you have some reservations?
No, because I always trained for whatever the artillery did. I learned how to direct artillery fire. On Guam, we did several exercises. Again, everything goes back to training. So it was not difficult for me to go into being a forward observer.
I see. So, but obviously under heavy fire, that was one of the times where you were probably, that was a new experience for you, and you probably were scared to some extent, weren't you?
Yeah, no, I wasn't scared. You could see more, and you could see some of the shells coming, and you could take some evasive action if you had to. But the fire was more sporadic and more active than on Guam. But fortunately, none hit our position where we were, or very close to it. But one of the other FO teams had an artillery shell blow up in their big hole where they were, and killed quite a few and wounded. And they had to send in another forward observer team.
Okay.
And that happened the same day that we landed.
So my understanding is D+2 you landed, D+3 you were basically in the same proximate area, which is on the one corner of the first airfield. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you describe what you did in that first couple days there?
All we did was just take care of ourselves, and the second day it started to rain a little bit, drizzle like. So, but we didn't do anything special. We just kept low, below the ground level, and didn't have that much artillery or mortars.
So you didn't call in much artillery support on those?
No, we weren't in the attack position. Our battalion was in reserve.
Okay. Now, this changed when you, obviously on D-Day +4, you had crossed over the first airfield and were on the other side. Can you describe what happened on that day?
Well, the transfer from D+3 to D+4, we passed a bunker burning, and evidently they threw some gasoline down the ventilators, or they threw some. Anyway, this thing was burning. It was a good-sized bunker, and a Jap came out of the one entrance with a gas mask on, because he evidently was in there, and he looked around, and of course the place was surrounded by Marines, and I don't think he took 10 steps and he was dead, because everybody was shooting at him. So and that happened just after we had passed the bunker. And we find our holes. On Iwo Jima, you didn't have to dig holes. They were all over the place because the Air Force bombed Iwo Jima 72 days in a row. And they made a lot of holes. So all of a sudden, there was a tremendous roar, and with that roar came the ships, and there were hundreds of ships there, blowing their horns or whistles or whatever they had, and naturally you turned around to look to your rear, and you noticed an American flag flying on the Mount Suribachi. So that is where when we saw that one flag, and what we saw was the first flag. We didn't know for years later that there was a second flag, but we only saw the first flag. We never saw the second flag going up because we were back to what we were supposed to be doing.
How long did that roar last of the Marines as well as the ship horns?
I'd say at least 10 minutes.
10 minutes. And you were, when that started, what were you doing?
Well, we was digging we were getting into our holes, trying to find holes because we were going to be there for the night.
I see. So when you've heard the roar from the Marines, you didn't really know what had happened?
No, we didn't know what happened until we looked to the rear. And I had binoculars so I could see, see the flag flying.
I see. What kind of feeling did you have at that moment?
I was elated, and most everybody was. But you didn't go around patting each other on the back or anything like that, but you were pretty happy.
Well, obviously it turned out to be a monumental moment for a number of reasons.
Yes, right.
So that was D4. Anything else exciting happened that day? Obviously that was a moment of
No, that was a monumental thing for that day.
Okay.
Everybody remembers D+4.
So then let's move to D+5. My understanding is you attacked the second airfield. But can you describe that attack and what the precursor was in terms of barrage and everything?
In the morning, we had a meeting with the battalion commander, and I was attached to K Company. You had one FO team per company. No, per battalion. And so this was Lieutenant Colonel Duplantis, and he said that the objective for today is to get the airfield because they have been trying for several days to capture the airfield, and they have not been successful. I think 3 days. And the airfield encompassed the O1 objective, where all the lines, where all the property would be captured up to that point. And here it is D+5, and we haven't got that point yet. So we then went back, and we were supposed to have tank support, and the tanks did not show up. So the word was to go. So we took off towards, we were running parallel with the runway, going to where the runways cross. That was our goal. And so we stopped, and I heard this terrific roar behind me, behind us, and I turned around, and the Marine Corps had rocket trucks, 3/4-ton trucks with rockets among them. And you had no way of adjusting for distance other than the elevation of the wheels of the truck. And lo and behold, I could see that they were our rockets, our own rockets, falling behind us and gradually creeping up towards where we were. It finally stopped behind us, and I'm sure it caused a lot of damage to, they claimed the machine gun section was pretty well wiped out. And then so we stopped, and my liaison officer with the battalion said, how come you're not firing at anything? And I said, well, I can't see anything to fire at. He said, well, pick out some prominent landmark and fire, see what happens. So I fired a mission for one round, and then the company commander said, you better hold off on that because I think we're there. So I fired only one round and told them to, cease firing because you couldn't see anything. And so we continued to take off, and there was a 47 millimeter gun that would be firing, and it would be above our head, but you could feel the pressure of this 47 millimeter thing going over your head. And so we stopped again, and the captain crawled up by the runway. It was a slope runway, and he yelled down to me, Green, toss me your compass. I lost my compass. So I reached to get back on my belt where I had the compass, and he said, yelled out at me to look out. Well, as I turned around, there was a Jap grenade sputtering. It had already been ignited, and as I watched it, for that 1 millisecond, it exploded. As I looked at it, and naturally, I instinctively ducked my head, and when I brought my head back up, there was another one, and it was sparkling too. So by that time, I had to be able to duck my head, and fortunately, because of the makeup of those Jap grenades, it would break into very minute pieces, except the top and bottom. And evidently one of the bottoms of those two grenades got the captain in the left thigh, upper thigh, and he came sliding down, and we had to evacuate him, and then the fire team got up to this spider hole and killed the Jap that was in there. And then then shortly thereafter, Lieutenant Archambault came up and took Heinz's place, and we went across the airfield. We climbed up over the ramp of the side of the airfield, and I couldn't get over all of the steel shards that were spread all over that runway. It must have been, all little pieces of steel. And we got to the high point, or just below the high point, and our infantry was on the reverse slope of the thing. And so there was a tank there. And the tank, and under the tank was a Marine that looked like he was pretty well gone. But the corpsman gave him an IV of, I guess, whole blood or whatever they gave him, and you could see the color come back to him. Evidently, he crawled out of the escape trap in the bottom of the tank. And but we had to keep going. And so we finally got to where we could dig our position in. And so I began firing indirect fire. In other words, I would select what would be a trench or a pillbox or something on the map and fire at that. And then after a while, one of the infantrymen that was right in the front lines came sliding down the slope, and he said that to move the artillery out because it's getting real close to us. So the captain said, well, go on back there and we'll see what we can do. So I said to him, what do you want me to do? He said, leave it where it is. So we kept firing, and we were there all night, and we were fired. And just after dark, we heard a tractor, and so behind us, we looked, and lo and behold, here's a caterpillar pulling a trailer with water and food. So that guy had to be real brave to do that in the dark. And so we did have some rations and things there. And so as we continued during the night, we would get under a poncho, with a light so we could see where we were going to fire. And pretty soon our telephone went out. So I sent two wiremen out to follow the line. And it wasn't very long before they came back and they said they couldn't find the break in the line. So then I took the Sergeant Chest, which was my scout sergeant, and him and I went out and followed the line, and we went out maybe 100 yards, I would say, in the middle of the night. Now, when at the night there was star shells fired by the Navy, so whenever one of those went off, we would stop what we were doing and just be still. And then when it went out, take off again. So we finally found the break in the line, and and the scout sergeant fixed the break. So then we followed the line back to our position. Fortunately, nobody took any shots at us. And then pretty soon, I continued to fire, indirect fire, because you couldn't see anything except that when these lights came and star shells came on. And so pretty soon, the operations officer of the 14th Marines. Now, our weapons were not ashore yet. So we were firing the artillery from the 4th Division, which was the 14th Marines. And this major gets on the line and said, "This is Major Karch, and I'm the operation officer, and you're using our ammunition up, and I'm getting afraid we're going to." And so I said to Major Karch, "This is Corporal Green from Iceland. He was one of the officers of Easy Battery, 2nd Battalion, 10th Marines in Iceland with me." So we discussed the situation, and he said, "Well, I'll just cut down on the number of rounds that I'll fire." So intermittently, he cut down on the rounds. But that was the whole night affair. So the morning on D+6, Sergeant Chest and I crawled up to where we could see much better than where we were before, and we noticed a trench to our left front. Now it might have been in the 5th Division sector, because we were the furthest unit up there from the 3rd Division, and the 5th Division was on our left, and we could see 1 or 2 Japanese. But then we noticed that when somebody fired a round, those 2 would disappear. So we set up a fire mission for that area, what we call time on target, TOT. And so I said to Chest, I said, "Let's wait until we see if any more comes out before we fire." Well, very slowly they came from wherever they were hiding, because that Iwo Jima was full of caves and everything else, and tunnels and things of that nature. So we waited, and about a dozen Japanese came out with their bayonets fixed in this trench, and we fired. We gave the artillery the word to fire time on target, and it was a perfect shot. I've never seen a better time on target, and wiped out all of those Japs in that hole. Well, by that time, we were told that we were going to be relieved by the 9th Marines at 8:30. Well, it wasn't until 11:30 till they finally got up to us because of all of the firing and things going on. So then we moved back into reserve. So on D+6, we spent the day in our foxholes, and one of the Marines came running over to my hole, and he said that he wanted permission to change his foxhole. So I said, "Sure, go ahead." And that's where a combat photographer took a picture of me in the foxhole. So that was D+6.
And that was published in what magazine?
Huh?
Where was that published?
That was published in a Collier's magazine in August 18th, 1945.
As part of an advertisement?
For the Illinois, or the Bell Telephone Company.
Right. Let me ask you a couple questions. You said the starbursts were sent out by the Navy. Was that really just to illuminate the field so that if there are any Japanese encroaching upon
Yes.
our positions, we'd be able to spot them? Is that right?
Right.
Okay. And can you also, when you were looking for that broken wire, that was at nighttime, did you have a flashlight? How were you able to see?
No, we didn't use a flashlight. We just found it was dark, and you found the two pieces that were cut. Simply, whether somebody ran over them or what, but it was a simple cut.
So you would basically just hold the wire and keep moving along until you felt something.
Right,
I see. So it's all by feel and not by sight.
right.
Now you mentioned earlier time on target. Can you explain what that means?
That means that you have a target that you want to use for artillery, but you don't want to do it until the target is at its maximum capacity. In other words, if we fired the artillery right away with those two Japs, that would be wasting ammunition. But we waited until about 12 got in there, and we said that's when we told them to fire. So the time on target is set so that 50% of the weapons are a air burst and 50% are ground burst. So that's what TOT means, and that's exactly what we got. We got air burst over that, and we got the shells bursting on the ground.
So that meant basically detonation that occurred. Half
Right.
of them detonated above the ground to spread the shrapnel,
Right,
cover a more effective area.
right.
Okay.
Air burst is more effective with personnel in the open.
Okay. So I think that brings us to about D+8. And can you describe what happened on that day by Matamoya Village? Or
On D+5, the I Company to our right, company commander was killed. And he was replaced with a new company commander. On the next attack on D+7 or 7-8, I was assigned from K Company to L Company. And the captain of L Company was Captain Stevenson. And so we got into relieved the 9th Marines in their position, and at 0800 behind a artillery barrage that kept moving forward, because whenever we fired artillery, the Japs would disappear. So we took off running, and we ran as far as we could before we stopped. And lo and behold, right where we stopped, 3 Japanese crawled out in front of us. I would say from where I am to where you are. And I pulled up my carbine, and I pulled the trigger and heard a bang. And I pulled the trigger again, and nothing happened. So then I put a new round in the chamber, and by that time these 3 Japs are dead. They had no weapons, they had helmets and their uniforms, but evidently they were manning an anti-aircraft gun or some sort of automatic weapon. And so I looked at my carbine, and I had the safety on. I never took the safety off when I started the attack, because the Marine Corps was always emphasizing, don't go shooting yourself. So it's very important that you turn on that safety when you're not in actual combat. And I forgot to put it on. So, so we continued with the attack, and we stopped again, and Captain Stevenson said, I don't know where the hell we are. So I looked at my map and I saw a road junction. And I said, well, I'll fire a smoke round at that road junction and see if, that's where, then we maybe find out where we are. So I put the message in to fire one smoke round, and then they would let you know on the way, and I could hear that projectile go over our heads, and it landed right on that road junction. It wasn't a road junction; it was a path, but but I guess from a map it looked like a road junction. So I said, now you know where the heck we are. So we got word to keep going to Modiyama village. And so we took off again, and we kept going, and we came to a rise, and you could tell that there is a machine gun firing. And I said to my crew, don't anybody hesitate at that top, because you're liable to get hit. And I went first, and my radio man went behind me, but two of my men must have hesitated up there on the top of that hill, and one of them got 2 bullets in his left leg that when we got back to Guam, it looked like a 4 on a dice. The other one must have had his arm at the knee bent, because he got bullets through both the lower and upper arm. 2 bullets. So it was, definitely a machine gun. And so we had to make arrangements to get them out of there and get them evacuated. But we continued the attack. In other words, I left them wounded, and other people came and removed them. And I never saw them after that again. So then we come down to a slope, and at the bottom of the slope, the radio man was laying next to me for the captain, and he yells out, and he gets hit. He gets a rifle bullet in the ankle from the rear. So we have Japs in front of us and Japs in back of us, but we don't see any Japs. Well, all of a sudden, the rocks in front of us start to shake, and what the heck's going on? Well, pretty soon, emerging from that rocks was a buried tank, and it is no more than 25 yards from us. And I'm looking down the muzzle of a 47 millimeter gun. And so I was so flabbergasted that I just froze. And everybody else did, because we had no anti-tank weapons. I only had a carbine. Nobody had any grenades. So we didn't have anything that, and it was so close I couldn't fire artillery. So that tank comes out of that hole, makes a 180-degree turn, and goes behind some other rocks. Well, by then I can fire artillery. Why those 3 Japs in that tank didn't pull the trigger, I'll never know. So then we decided that's the end of the fighting for that day for us. so I had to put in fire concentrations. So what happened is I told the radio man our telephone wasn't working. Two of our wiremen were wounded, so we crawled out, and as we crawled out, well, you could feel some bullets going by. So we fired our concentrations, and I said, okay, you go back first, the radio man, and he didn't want to go. He said, I can hear those bullets. So I said, okay, I'll go first. Give me the radio. So I took the radio, and I went first and got back okay, and then he came back too. So there we dug in for the night. Now you couldn't dig very deep because Iwo Jima means sulfur island, and it was a sulfur mines that the Japs had there. So if you dug more than a foot deep, it would be so hot that at night you could only lay on one side for a certain period of time before you turned over on the other side. So you couldn't get a decent night's sleep. But what you could do is you could bury your sea ration cans and have a hot meal. So that worked out pretty good. So after spending the night there, and just as dawn began to break, someone yells, "Look out!" And we look behind us. 3 Japs are running. Again, no weapons, just their helmets on. And by the time that you could react to pull up your weapon or anything, they were gone. So I don't know what happened to those 3 Japs.
So this was D+9.
Yeah.
Was there anything else that occurred that day?
Well, D+9, they decided that we would attack 90 degrees from where we had done previously. So we started off on the attack for that part, and I don't know if you ever see Iwo Jima on the History Channel or anything, but you see a Japanese burning in a trench. Well, I ran right past him, and then, lo and behold, I could see a TBM torpedo bomber that came flying in and flying low. Well, the rule was with artillery, if artillery is firing, the aircraft should not be below 500 feet. Well, this guy must have been 200 feet high, and he must have been an observer trying to find out where the front lines are. And I saw an artillery shell near the end of its trajectory hit behind the rear gunner in the tail, and and the plane nosed over, so you could see the pilot reacting to pull the plane up, and when he pulled the stick back, the tail broke off, and he spun down into about 200 yards in front of us. And but we kept going, and we got to a position where the northern part of the island was all crags and rocks and things of that nature, so you couldn't tell where the artillery was. So the captain, Stevenson, says we're going to attack and see what you can find out about the artillery. Well, I was trying to observe the artillery, and I couldn't see. I couldn't figure out. There was artillery exploding all over the place. I couldn't tell whether it was mine or who it was. So I put my radio man down behind the rock so he would be protected, and I would be running up and down the rocks or the hill. It's a little hill, maybe 15 feet or so. And every time I would be running down, I could feel bullets flying by. So one time running back down to give him instructions to see what we could find out what the artillery was, that bullet went through my left arm, through all of my clothes, my jacket and my underclothes and everything, but just left a burn mark on me, but knocked me down. So I went down and got the radio man straightened out, and then I went back up there to observe, and I was observing in a V in the rocks. There was rocks, all over the place. So pretty soon the runner from Captain Stevenson tapped me on the shoulder and said, "The captain wants to see you. We're going to do another attack." And I take 3 steps and somebody yells out, "Your scout sergeant's hit." Well, I turned around and went back because my scout sergeant would usually take my place when I left because he was always with me. It wasn't my scout sergeant, it was the mortar observer. And he had a bullet hole right here through his helmet into his head. He never knew what hit him. 3 steps away. And if it wasn't for Captain Stevenson to tell me, go get green, it would have been me.
Who was that? Who was the mortar observer? Do you remember?
Huh?
Do you know his name, the mortar observer?
No, I didn't know, because he was a member of the, of the L Company.
I see.
In other words, we didn't get to know each other, that well. We knew the officers. That's about all.
I see.
And so we ended up there for that night.
And then I think at D+10 you were relieved, and
At D+10, you couldn't. We were so close to the end, and everything was rocks and ragged, and you couldn't see to fire artillery. You couldn't have a flat area any place, and you could never try to fire at a cave or something because they were all lower than the other surroundings. So artillery became ineffective, and the only thing that they could use was mortars. So they said, "Well, pull your team back," and so we headed back and went back to the battery position, and then the battery commander, the battery exec said, "There's my bunk, just go in there and sleep." So that's like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I didn't wake up till about 11 o'clock the next day.
I guess you needed some rest.
I needed the rest.
Well, while we have you on Iwo Jima, what I'd like to do is hold this map over and just have you point out these key days that you were in that location. So can you kind of point to us where you were circling on D-Day +1?
I was on the USS Boulevard right here. We were right here, and this is where we circled all day.
And then, of course, and that was your birthday.
That was my birthday.
And then where did you go in on Red Beach there on D+2?
We again got into the LVT, or the landing craft, and we landed up here at D+2 on the Red Beach. And right here is where we had I would guess it probably was a big Navy shell hole, and that's where we spent D+2 and D+3 before we got the word to move out on D+4.
And then can you show us where you're moving to D4?
And we went along the runway here, and we got up and about here for D+4.
And that's, of course, where in the middle of the day. What time did you hear the shouting?
That was, we got there early in the morning, and 10 o'clock or 10:30 or somewhere around noontime is when they raised the flag down here.
Mount Suribachi.
Yeah, Mount Suribachi.
Okay.
So you can see we weren't even halfway there. The 01 line was across here.
Right. And then you can show me perhaps where you move up to D+5.
Yeah, D+5 was the date of the attack here, and where the major captain got wounded, and the other captain came up, and this is where we got those Japs in the time on target.
And then, but you also got hit with the grenades there too.
Yeah,
right?
here we got the grenades here before we got up over there.
I see. And then can you show us where D+6, where they took that famous shot of you in the foxhole?
Yes, that was down in here somewhere.
Okay. And then D+7, you
Then we
moved farther
started
north.
the attack here, and with Captain Stevenson, and this is where the tank came to get us.
D+8.
D+8 and D+9 is where the mortar observer got killed, where he was observing in my place.
Right. And then you went out on March 17th.
Yes.
Over onto the
Yeah,
west
went
side.
back to the battery position, and then on the 17th we left. Now
Wow.
on the 27th, 300 Japs got up from underground and attacked the Army Air Force, P-51 pilots. They were sleeping on cots and in pyramidal tents, and they lost quite a few, and there were still some Marines there, and they helped in that Banzai attack. But they killed all those 300
What
Japanese.
part of the island was that on? Do you remember?
I would say it probably would be. Would be over in this area here somewhere.
I see. Now, as you could probably point out too that this map is fairly accurate, but that all those squares represent a number, right?
Yes.
And when you called in, just to understand your role as a forward observer, when you called in artillery, each one of those squares are numbered, so that would be your first call out. And then each of those squares, if you look in the top left corner, they're subdivided A, B, C, D going from left to right, and then F going the next row down, and then K the next row down. So each of those squares are subdivided by the alphabet.
Right.
And then, if I understand this correctly, each of those letters, there's 5 segments within there. So 1,
Right.
2, 3, 4, 5, 5 being in the middle.
Right.
So if you wanted to call out, for instance, where the tank was, I believe that's 217, and we would call that 217H3, and you would be able to localize that fire.
Right.
Okay.
That's how simple that they got it, because all of your artillery is surveyed in. They knew where they were located, and They didn't know where you were other than the way you told them.
And basically, that you had a map like this that gave you these quadrants and showed you where you were
Right.
relative to all that. Now, could you do me a favor and just provide for me a command line when you called in artillery? Could you say, okay, just give me a command line, what you would have said when you're calling in artillery fire? And I believe I wrote one down here if you want to review that. But is that similar to a command line that you would have called out?
Yeah, we would say, for instance, fire mission, enemy tank, coordinates 181B5, type of munition, smoke would be armor piercing, 1 round. And then once the round would land, you would direct it which way you wanted it to go if it was not on target. Like, for instance, you could go right 100 and down 200. Then they would fire another round. If that hit on target, then you would say fire for effect, and maybe they would fire a half a dozen rounds.
Okay, so the type of munition could have been a smoke, armor piercing, or HE.
Right.
You designated that.
That's right.
And then if they were on target, you'd say fire for effect.
Right.
And if you wanted to spread, like you mentioned earlier, time on target would give half of them exploding above ground.
Right.
Okay. All right. We've got a couple more minutes here. I thought we'd ask you just a couple more questions.
Oh, let me tell you one thing.
Sure.
That I forgot to tell you. They had rockets up here, and these rockets were up in the northern end. They were so powerful that when they fired them, they had no control over the distance. They looked like 55-barrel drums of gasoline flying through the air way up, and I saw one go all the way over Mount Suribachi.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Do you think in all the campaigns you're involved in the Pacific that the weather played an important role?
No, it didn't play an important role.
So the rain didn't bother you, the heat? And
No,
that?
you just put up with it.
Okay. Do you think as you had obviously trading, but then you got in the field, do you believe that the insights that you gained on the battlefield helped you to learn and to conduct yourself in subsequent battlefield? Do you think your experience level made a big difference?
Oh, no question about it. Yeah.
Okay. So there was a learning curve then?
Yeah, there was a learning purpose there, like Bougainville, and you learned a lot there that would help you at Guam, and
Okay.
so forth and so on.
Did you also learn in terms of either survival techniques, how to physically survive, or how to handle the emotional or psychological impact of the warfare?
No, I really didn't. As far as your protection, you spent hours and hours digging foxholes. And every place you went, you ended up digging foxholes, except on Iwo Jima. On Iwo Jima, I never dug a foxhole.
Okay.
There were so many bombs and so many artillery shells and everything. There was holes all over that island.
Now, obviously, we believe that communication is very important, but in your business, whether you were directing a gun battery or as a FO, communication was of paramount importance.
Right.
And so that was one of the key things. You had to maintain those lines of communication. If you didn't, your job was over, right?
Yeah, we had two ways of communication, radio and SCR 300 radios. Now, the radios were not that effective, so you always tried to keep your telephone running. And the guys that were really important for that were the wiremen. The wiremen really never got the credit that they deserved.
Do you think the there are any attributes that make either a non-com or a commissioned officer an effective leader? Or if there are 2 or 3 attributes, what would you say the most important attributes for a good leader in the battlefield?
I would say probably that you could, if you could just be as calm as you could get, and be able to be able to reason right, that to tell somebody what to do.
So under stressful combat conditions, if you had somebody that was calm, collect, would assemble the information, and make rational decisions, that's one of the most effective.
That's in my opinion, yes.
Okay. How about, do you think the concept of leadership, where if he sends a non-com once it needs a patrol to be sent out, if he leads it rather than just sending someone else to do it, do you think that is a good sign of leadership?
I think it depends on the conditions. Sometimes it's better for the leader to be in the middle. Sometimes it would be better, like for instance in the jungle, because he has to have information, and the only place he can get it is the guy up in front. And but in an open area, there's nothing wrong with being out front, because you can see so much more.
Right. Thank you. So, Mr. Green, we're back on, and we had previously asked you about attributes that make a combat leader effective. Do you recall any specific leaders that you had, either officers or non-coms, that displayed those qualities that make them effective? Anybody you want to highlight?
We had one lieutenant named Tolles, who, when I first saw him, I was used to most of the officers being from Annapolis or something like that, or being longtime Marines. And this guy was so skinny and so, what the heck's happening with these officers? It turns out he was one of the more responsible officers. On his, while we were on Guadalcanal, they sent a group of officers for another landing, some little island, and he went as a forward observer, and he did a terrific job. On Bougainville, they decided that they were going to attack a piece of the beach south of our Torquena position. And they put together a group of raiders and paratroopers, a battalion of each. And with this battalion, there had to be 2 forward observers. And Bob Tolles was one of them. Well, they thought they were going to be landing in a unoccupied area, but lo and behold, it was full of Japs. They never got off of the beach, and they spent the whole day there, and they had to evacuate them with landing craft and destroyers and things of that nature. And Bob Tolles and his radio operator were the last ones to leave, because they were responsible for directing 155 howitzers. That's how far they were. And these were Army howitzers to give coverage for evacuation. And he was him and his radio operator was two of the last men off of that beach. And uh, we had another lieutenant forward observer there. And right now I can't think of his name, but they both got the Silver Star. And he turned out to be, the most important guy, officer there was. And I first looked at him and said, "My God, what are we going to get? What are we getting in the Marine Corps?" So you never know by looks.
So his calm state, his ability to think straight in the battlefield, and his courage,
yeah,
helped him through that, and so it really materialized.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else that you think that met those criteria, or anybody else personally that you knew?
No, I don't think so. There wasn't anybody. The only thing that I can say is I thought everybody did as good a job as they could.
I see.
And in wartime, accidental deaths is going to happen all the time because you can't tell exactly where everybody is. As those rockets, and then on Guam, we had a situation where we were practicing for Evo. And I was the forward observer. And so we finished one phase and we were moving up to the second phase. And in the second phase, we were walking along a flat ground, but 25 feet in front of us was a drop of 5 or 6 feet and then a gentle slope down. What they were doing was having tanks in the front of the infantry, but they were firing airburst to see if they could protect the tanks of Japs trying to attack with mortars. And so as we were walking forward, I could tell artillery after a while. You could tell where it's all coming from and everything. And I yelled to my men, "Hit the deck," because I could hear right above my head a whistle of a shell, a projectile. And that landed within that machine gun section down there and killed or wounded 25 people in the infantry. And as I looked over my scout sergeant, there's a piece of flesh on his back, and I thought he got hit, but it was from somebody that, from the other shell. And you know what? We never found out, the enlisted men, never found out who goofed, because I didn't fire anything, because, I was moving up. But somebody fired a 105 howitzer.
Unfortunately, that's the nature of the business, isn't it?
That's what happens all the time, and you.
Yeah. Well, my next question is really a generic question related to being a Marine. Do you think that, and some would consider Marines, in a sense, a special force, a very effective soldier, is it really the training that they receive, or is it really the fact that it's the individual who wants to enter the Marine Corps that makes the difference? They want to be one of the best. They want to be out in front.
I would say that would be it, because basically, in all of the services, you're going to find top-notch people that could make a good military man. But the Marines, because of their close relationship and their don't leave anybody behind, and their semper fidelis and things of that nature, it all ties together for for being a good service.
Okay. Now, you have a Bronze Star on your chest there. Was that for a particular event, or was that for your service?
That was for D+5 on Iwo Jima.
So would you say, was that probably your most important contribution to the Iwo Jima campaign, or would you say that's what you got the Bronze Star for? I mean,
I would say that would be the best contribution that I had made at that time. All the other stuff was, you know, was pretty much routine.
okay. Were there any moments that you really were saddened by an event? Obviously, you saw people die in front of you and all that, but was there any particular moment that really kind of threw you for a loop for a while?
No, I'll tell you, it never really bothered me. I was really never scared except on Bougainville because you couldn't see anything ahead of you. So when where I got to where I could see everything or most everything, uh, I just never had any feeling that anything was going to happen to me.
Obviously, you have a lot of memories that aren't wonderful about your battlefield experiences, but were there any moments in your military tour of duty that you have good thoughts, happy memories? There was some collegiality you had with the fellow Marines, or something that you guys did together that was, you know, just fun? And do you remember anything like that?
No, I really don't. It's just that I just been so proud of being that part of the time and doing what I thought would be a good job.
What would you say if you could say there were one, two, or three very important things that you learned from your military experience? What would you say those were?
One, aggressiveness. The other was you got to be sure you know what you're doing. And third, you probably have faith in your associates.
So having a camaraderie and confidence
Right.
in all your fellow Marines. Are there any comments or pearls of wisdom other than those three things that you would provide for future generations? Is there anything you would suggest that we try to pursue?
No, I'm not much of a deep thinker. So, but the only thing that I think I could say is that, you know, I didn't think about all that happened to me until sometime in the late 60s when somebody was going to write a book about Iwo Jima. I think his name was Newton, and had put an ad in the Chicago Tribune for information about the battle. And I thought, well, you know, I ought to sit down and write that. Well, that started me over the years. I've written about my whole experience, and it, you know, I got something I can leave for my family. There's so many servicemen that did awful good things that probably didn't sit down and write the information about what they did, because it was a unusual time of our country's life.
It was definitely a defining moment in the history of Western civilization.
I would think so.
And you and your generation stepped up to the plate and saved the world.
Well, we did.
And it's a unique generation to say the least. I know that some have left the war and after the war continued to be plagued by, the trauma of war, and it had the psychological impact on them for a long period. Did you experience anything like that?
No, I didn't, and I've thought about that occasionally, and because I have friends that, like my friend Bob Williams, who was, uh, he had a retriever tanks. His job was to retrieve tanks, and he couldn't talk about it because you get a tank that's all blasted, and he's got to clean it and put it back in shape. And he must have been exposed to a lot of gory stuff. I fortunately was not that exposed to that much stuff. Uh, it was pretty much straight out, and so I think those who are exposed to the viciousness of the battle compared to those who are exposed to it but not exposed too much to the gory part about it would be able to continue life with no problem.
And I guess maybe wrapping this up, but would you say the friendships, the guys that you knew back there, you experienced the things you did with them, left in you a lifelong bond? And whether they were a Marine that actually served in your outfit, but if you were to go back and go to meetings or whatever and meet a fellow Marine that served with you in the Pacific, you have an immediate bond with him, I'm sure, right?
Yes, in fact, I was like I appointed myself the local historian of the 2nd Battalion, 12th Marines. And I started out with about 300 people, and I may be down to 30. But there are 3 or 4 people that, like my battery commander on Guam, every time I go to California, we have lunch together. He's 95 years old. There's a Marine gunner who ended up being a captain in the Marine Corps in Florida. And I'm still in touch with him. I have a couple in Chicago whose father was in the same reserve unit with me, but never left any information. And what I have sent them, it's amazing how thrilled they are to have that information. So there's still people that I am in touch with that I would love to see forever.
So with wrapping up, is there anything you would bestow the future generations? Anything that you would say, we fought for your freedom, what would you request that they do in their lives?
Well, I would say the love of the country is probably the most important. And I think that we don't have a lot of that today. And I wish we get it back.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you taking the time to tell about your experiences in World War II and your extraordinary service.
I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green.